Hey, what's up, you guys? Welcome back to Andy's Book Club. So, this week we're covering chapter 7 of The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. And this is going to be a case study. And yeah, just to warn you before we get started, this chapter does deal with rather dark topics like suicide and addiction. If that bothers you, you've been warned. This chapter opens up with a story, and it's a story about this teenage boy named Sima who grew up in the South Pacific island nation of Micronesia. Basically, suicides in Micronesia went from practically non existent to being 7 times higher than the US average per capita. The pattern of suicide was that the suicide victim was always a young male in their late teens. Once the story of the suicide of this one particular teenager broke, suicides became something that's unnervingly familiar in Micronesia, meaning that the suicide rate skyrocketed. This is kind of how this point of this story was not to bring you down, but just to get you to recognize the root of the problem. And the root of the problem is that suicides kind of spread like an epidemic as well, even though you don't think of it as like a regular infectious disease, but it does have a lot of the same characteristics as an infectious disease. We'll circle back to that, but first I want to talk about smoking as well. Smoking remains a problem, even though smokers know the dangers of smoking. So that's another example of like an epidemic, right? Suicide and smoking both have this kind of imitation factor associated with them, where if you see someone do it first, then you will become more likely to do it yourself. The case with the suicides in Micronesia was that you see someone do it, and it kind of gives you this quote unquote permission to learn to do the same. The first suicide gives everyone else permission, quote unquote, and this is not like I didn't just make that word up, or I didn't just use that word on my own. This is what the author of Gladwell described as what's going on, right? Permission to commit suicide. So basically, it's like a trigger. You see somebody commit suicide, and in the back of your head, you're like, "Is that a solution to my problems?" Right? And just to be clear, if you really need help, like go seek help. Don't like jump to random conclusions, and don't like do these mental spirals. They're not healthy. Okay, so yeah, if you need help, please seek help. But this is just like an example to get you to recognize kind of the characteristics of someone who's struggling, and if you yourself are struggling, again, there's resources that are available to help you. Smoking also has a lot of similar characteristics, where the fact that smokers themselves are usually people that are associated with being cool or being sophisticated. This is kind of the root of the problem, and this is why people get into smoking mostly, right? And the war on smoking, which, if you've been to any school in the Western education system in US, Canada, whatever, they always try to make it so that they all try to convince you not to smoke, right? But it's not very effective because it focuses too much on the dangers of smoking, and people already know the dangers of smoking. But what they should be focused on is, disrupting this message that smoking is cool. So that's what they should be focused on. And until they get rid of this image that smoking is cool, people are still going to do it despite knowing the dangers. So smoking demonstrates the law of the few and the stickiness factor. So it's a very sticky idea, right? Once it becomes known that in the mainstream media that smoking is cool, that's a very sticky message. And the law of the few is that you have a few people that are influential that may be taking up smoking and maybe like promoting it to a certain extent, either directly or indirectly, and then you have people that just want to follow them. So moving on, you can kind of see these small things happen everywhere, right? So they did a study on adopted children that showed that parents actually had a very little amount of influence on what the child turned out to be. And they did this study on children that are adopted and not adopted. And what they figured out was, the nature versus nurture debate, whether someone's, by nature a certain way or by nurture a certain way. So what they figured out through this study was that nurture had a bigger portion on the influence of how the child turned out rather than nature. An example of this would be a child of immigrant parents often do not retain their parents' accents. So their environment, their upbringing had a much bigger influence on their lives compared to their innate human nature. So some personality traits are also acquired laterally, meaning that you acquire it from people that are within your social standing or within your social class, within your social circle. So telling kids not to smoke for health reasons is not effective because it's kind of like a parent or a teacher talking down to the child, right? And it doesn't work because usually people fare better when it comes from their friend. So this is why sometimes you may feel the same, where if you have a problem, some of you may feel, I would imagine most of you may feel more comfortable talking about it with a friend than with your parent. I don't know, maybe some of you are close with your parents, but I think for the vast majority of people, it's not like they don't have that kind of relationship with their parent, and it's not because their parents are bad people. It's just because, you feel more comfortable talking to someone within your own social circle. So the nicotine in tobacco has similar properties to dopamine, which is what makes it addictive as well. So it's not just, it is a chemical reason as well why, it's so hard to quit smoking. So once you're hooked, it's hard for you to get past it. So some antidepressants were found to be helpful in getting people to quit smoking because it has to do with dopamines, right? People who need that dopamine hit, they try to get it from everywhere, and they find that smoking is the thing that gives them that dopamine hit, when in fact it might be a chemical imbalance problem within your body. So some studies have shown that antidepressants help, but again, this is not medical advice. Please ask your doctor if you're trying to quit smoking and it's not working, right? So don't just take it from this book. It's not a medical book, but it's just an effect or a phenomenon that was observed through certain studies. But yeah, anyways, there is also a difference between chippers, and a chipper is someone who smokes 1 or 2 cigarettes once in a while, but don't get addicted, and addicts who chain smoke. So the transition from a chipper to an addict is also a tipping point. So some people can dabble in cigarettes and they don't get addicted, but once they hit a certain point, then it tips, and then they become a full-on addict and they start chain smoking and stuff. So just this whole chapter is just about framing things and looking at things like addiction and suicides, and even serious topics that aren't talked about a lot in society, but when we look at them through the lenses of the tipping point, I think that's where you can really see the root of problems and maybe find a way to solve these problems. So that's kind of the point of this case study. Again, very interesting chapter. This is also one of my favorite chapters, even though it's kind of dark, but I think, you guys will appreciate this chapter as well. So give this chapter a read if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. And we'll wrap this episode up here. Next week, we are finishing the book. So next week, we'll cover the conclusion and the afterword, and then we'll be done with The Tipping Point by Malcolm Gladwell. So thank you all for watching. I'll see you guys next week. Bye-bye.